Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm very happy to be here, and it's hard to follow such a wonderful presentation from Tatiana, but hopefully a few words will be useful. The theme of this conference is about accelerating the impacts of agroforestry. But what kind of impacts do we want? What sort of future are we hoping to build? And what kind of science do we need to get us there? I want to use my 15 minutes to show you a few frameworks developed in the last few years, which I think can be helpful to us when we're thinking about how to make agroforestry a more effective and widespread use for the future. This works. The first is the Planetary Boundaries framework put forward by Johan Rockström and his colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Institute. They define 9 interlinked biophysical processes which are essential to maintain the Earth as a viable place for humanity to continue to thrive in the way we have done in the Anthropocene. For each process, they define a threshold above which, they argue, we risk irreversible change or a tipping point. While they're still arguing about the exact thresholds, I think the idea that there are planetary thresholds which affect all of us and which we need to manage at a global level is quite a powerful one. On the diagram, if you're not familiar with it, the inner green shading represents the proposed safe operating space for these 9 planetary systems, and the red wedges represent an estimate of the current position for each variable. And as you can see, we've already greatly exceeded the boundaries in 3 of these systems, which are the rates of biodiversity loss, climate change, and human interference in the nitrogen and also the phosphorus cycle. Obviously, it's immediately clear that agroforestry has a lot to offer on each of these processes, but there are still significant information gaps. On the biodiversity loss, that's the boundary which we've transgressed the most, according to Rockström et al. Extinction rates today are estimated to be 100 to 1,000 times more than natural background rates. So we know that agroforestry is a more diverse production system than conventional agriculture, but there's still much we need to know about how and when agroforestry best supports what kind of biodiversity. Should we be promoting agroforestry as part of the so-called land sharing system, in which you've got agriculture and conservation on the same piece of land? Or is it more effective to go for the land sparing approach, where you have them on 2 separate land areas? I think the research on this topic is still just starting, but it's very clear that it depends on the type of agroforestry being practiced and the type of biodiversity that you're looking to conserve. Some species do well in agroforestry landscapes, others need large expanses of their natural habitat. So we need to be specific about what we're talking about when we do this research. Rockström and colleagues highlighted the role of agriculture in perturbing the natural nitrogen cycle. Agriculture, through its manufacture of fertilizers and cultivation of leguminous crops, converts around 120 million tons of nitrogen from the atmosphere each year. That's more than the combined effects of all Earth's terrestrial processes. Agroforestry is obviously beneficial in that it reduces the need for artificial fertilizers through the use of leguminous crops and manure, for example. But leguminous plants are nevertheless still fixing atmospheric nitrogen, so we do need to understand more about what constitutes just the right amount of nitrogen at different scales and in different contexts. Similarly, we need to know the same about phosphorus needs of different systems and make sure we're applying them at the right amounts. We've already heard a lot about climate change at this conference, but really we need to move ahead on 2 fronts. One is adaptation, and the multiple products provided by agroforestry systems provide a certain resilience to farmers, helping them to survive whatever the weather and the economy throw at them. However, the longevity of the tree components is a risk. We need to be sure that farmers are planting the right varieties for their area, both now and into the future with their changing climates. So we need more research into the appropriate varieties for different ecosystems and much better forecasting of likely climate change impacts in different areas, and much better information to farmers about weather when we do have that information. Social science also has much to offer here, providing, for example, more information about how best to operate affordable and reliable insurance schemes for smallholder farmers. We also need to mitigate, and there was a whole session devoted to the extent to which agroforestry can contribute to sequestering carbon above and below ground. But we still need to understand more about the trade-offs between managing for carbon and for other products in agroforestry systems so that farmers can be properly compensated for this new product. On the social side, we need much more understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of various mechanisms like REDD+ to incentivize tree planting. Work I did in Uganda a couple of years ago suggests that if farmers are not provided with the right information, they and their children can be tied into very long-term contracts for 50 years, for example, to plant and maintain tree species which are not necessarily the most appropriate for their particular livelihood strategies. And unfortunately, we found those contracts don't have information about what happens if farmers change their minds because of changing markets or personal circumstances, so that they want to convert their trees to some other land use. So we need to understand more about these mechanisms and how they fit into a dynamic and changing world. As a more socially inclined scientist, I was very happy when Kate Raworth, who was the chief economist at Oxfam, added an important social dimension to Rockstrom's diagram. She argued that while we certainly need to live within the planet's biophysical boundaries, we also need to recognize the need for more development to ensure that all people on this planet are able to live a healthy and fulfilled life. She called this the social foundation, below which nobody should fall. The 11 themes that she includes in this diagram were based on priorities put forward by governments in their submissions to the Rio +20 conference in 2012. And in the diagram, you can see the blue area indicates the proportion of people in the world who are below the social foundation in each respect. So taking food as an example, the blue area there represents the 13% of the world's population, that's 850 million people, who are still undernourished. For some issues, like resilience, voice, and jobs, she's left the area blank because we have no internationally agreed metrics on these data or data on these important issues. And if you take each one of these in turn, you'll find that agroforestry has a potentially important role to play in supporting people to reach the social foundation, either directly through the provision of sufficient and nutritious food, for example, or indirectly through generation of income to invest in education. But looking through the conference program, I notice that the areas that we perhaps haven't covered enough yet are gender equality. Tony mentioned that yesterday, and Tatiana and I are doing our best to help on that front here. But also social equity. We haven't really done enough on how agroforestry can promote social equity or empowerment. How can agroforestry help to empower farmers to have a stronger voice in negotiating with other actors in the system? And also in jobs. Finally, jobs are so important. Whenever you go to rural areas, you talk to the poorest, the landless, the people who have land that's too small to really do any kind of profitable agriculture. What do they want? They want jobs. And I've seen very little in this program that talks about the many jobs that agroforestry can offer, both in production, but also in processing and marketing. Raworth then went on to combine her own diagram with that of Rockstrom to produce this one. It's often referred to as the donut because it shows this green donut-shaped space between the social foundation and the planetary boundaries. This is a space which is both safe and just for humanity, and in which the interdependence of human well-being and planetary well-being are assured. I find it a very positive vision. Rather than telling us where we don't want to go, a 2-degree rise or more in temperature, for example, or more than 10 billion people on the planet, it gives us an indication, a vision of where we do want to go at a global level. And it can also be helpful when it comes to examining our own actions, both as individuals and as professionals. This is my last diagram. This one's produced by the previous authors, Rockstrom, Raworth, and Melissa Leach from the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. And Leach and her colleagues have been working on this idea that there are multiple pathways to sustainability. And in this diagram, they attempt to integrate that idea with the donut concept. And you can see that there isn't just one, but many ways of staying within this safe and just operating space, depending on your local context. And we recognise that in agroforestry, which can range from very small, highly diverse, family-based systems, sort of home garden systems in the tropics, to extensive parklands in the Sahel with some communal management and commercial-scale systems in temperate zones. But it's important to recognise those pathways that threaten to drop people below the social foundation or push us up above the planetary boundaries. And I think there's a very important role for social scientists here, because the direction and the distributional or equity outcomes of different pathways are often not determined by the particular agroforestry technology being practiced, but rather by the behaviour of various actors, the interaction of knowledge and power, and the political economy. So particularly important for us is to understand what role agroforestry plays in farmers' livelihood strategies. Not all farmers are the same, and yet we continue to look for and develop one-size-fits-all packages. And a distinction made by Dorwood et al. Might be helpful to keep in mind when we try to understand why the uptake of agroforestry often seems to be less successful than we hope for. Dorwood distinguishes three types of farmers: those who are just hanging in the face of great adversity often, they're unable to take any risks, and they often have to diversify out of desperation. So when we talk about agroforestry producing diversification, it's a good thing. We have to be aware that for some people, it's despair that drives them to diversification. Then there are those who are stepping up, able to invest in and expand their activities, whether that means expanding their agroforestry to a greater area or adding new or better crops. And then the final group, who are stepping out and may see agroforestry as a means of accumulating enough to move on to more lucrative activities, perhaps still in the rural economy, as in processing or marketing, which makes them an important advocate of agroforestry. We need to be aware then of which category farmers are in and realise they'll want different things from their farming systems. As Howard Shapiro said very eloquently yesterday, agroforestry should not be about poverty, but about prosperity. And that may include eventually getting out of farming altogether. We need to also recognise that there will also always be trade-offs between the products desired by different beneficiaries with different levels of power and persuasion. So, for example, will commercial plantations of agroforestry tree products be able to operate alongside smallholders and not take away the opportunities that smallholder producers have? I hope so, but we need to look at how best to organise that. And can smallholders produce both conservation benefits or carbon sequestration at the same time as maintaining and improving their livelihoods? So resolving those trade-offs requires transparent processes with very clear criteria and an idea of where we want to go. That's why having that vision of the future is very important. And here's another area with a need for more social science input: understanding the political economy of decision-making. However good our evidence, we can't be sure that decisions will be just and fair until we understand power dynamics at all levels. We also need in this area to collaborate with civil society and governments much more to support farmers and farmer associations to negotiate fair deals. So coming back to my original question of what kind of science we need, first of all, we need good science. It's got to be good quality, because farmers cannot afford to take risks. We can't give them the wrong information or one information and turn around the following year and tell them something else. So our science must be rigorous, and we have to provide clear information about not just the biophysical, but also the socioeconomic context in which it was carried out, so that we know what can or cannot be scaled up and out to other areas. We need to recognise that there may be big contextual constraints, gender relations, for example, caste systems or market systems, which are very different in different systems, so that research in one area may not easily be transferable to another. And we shouldn't be scared to report failures, because we can often learn as much from what does not work as from what does. And I was pleased on some of the posters yesterday to see very open and honest acknowledgements of some failings. We need to make sure that science is integrated across multiple dimensions. And I did try to draw another diagram here, but too many dimensions. I couldn't make that one work. So across local to global scales, we have products that are sold locally to those like carbon that are being produced for global benefit as well. And that means understanding how market chains operate at those different scales and for those different products. We also need to look at different temporal scales. for example, seasonal weather cycles, but multi-year economic and political cycles. And unfortunately, those biophysical and institutional processes don't always operate at the same scale, so that makes life quite complicated. We need to integrate across indigenous knowledge to modern science, and from the biophysical to the social sciences. And on the social science, I'm particularly thinking about the political economy and understanding the big drivers of change, which are important in determining uptake. We can't work just on our agroforestry systems. We need to know what else is going on in the landscape and the economy that is determining farmers' decision-making. And we need science that is carried out by multiple actors, engaging public sector and private sector from the beginning. Only then can we avoid that gap that we often see between sound evidence on the one hand and poor policy on the other, or between good policy and poor implementation. Finally, working with a range of different partners should also help ensure that science is demand-led and oriented towards a positive goal. Namely, I would suggest enabling people to pursue their multiple agroforestry pathways towards prosperity in a way that doesn't push us over the planetary boundaries. Thank you.